You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, nonpartisan look at a range of subjects that matter most to business leaders. To help make sense of these topics, we'll sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best at the Conference Board, provide trusted insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland from the Conference Board and the host of this series, and in today's conversation, we will examine the phenomenon of gray swans. If you're listening to this podcast regularly, you've heard of black swans, which are entirely unforeseen events that can't be predicted. Well, we're going to talk about gray swan events today. Joining me today is Dana Peterson, the Chief Economist here at the Conference Board. Dana, welcome.
Hi, Steve. It's great being here.
So, Dana, you've written about gray swans, which are different from black swans. Can you just first describe for everybody what's a black swan, and then what's the difference between that and a gray swan?
Absolutely. A black swan is an unimaginable high-impact event that really affects the global economy, or at least large regions. On the other hand, gray swans are predictable but low probability events that, if they are realized, they will have a major impact. So to give an example of each, the pandemic really was a black swan. It's not that we haven't had pandemics in the past, but they're infrequent, 100, 200-year events, and no one was expecting this to happen. And once it did happen, well, 3 years later, we're still seeing the repercussions of that. So that's kind of a black swan event, right? A gray swan event is, an example would be the war in Ukraine. So for example, if you go back to 2021, late during that period of time, we were hearing in the news, potentially Russia might invade Ukraine. Lots of people thought that was just ridiculous. Why would they do that? Why would they start a war? But certainly in the US, policymakers were gearing up for such an event. And then when it happened, it still shocked the world. And even a year later, we're seeing the repercussions of that in terms of high inflation, certainly the humanitarian crisis, and even ramping up of tensions in the last few days.
Right. So gray swan events are, I guess, predictable is what you're saying in some sense, but because they're low probability, even though they're predictable, what should businesses be doing about it? Should you just be, planning on these things all the time?
I think the answer is yes. We've certainly seen over the last, 20 years, a number of really surprising events. We had the great financial crisis that started in the US with a housing collapse, but spread throughout the world. Then we saw the sovereign debt and banking crisis in Europe. And then we had the pandemic, and then we had the war in Ukraine, which is having global influence. And so I think businesses should always, certainly have a set of risks that they're focused on, but keep these gray swan events, these kind of low probability events, in their minds and make sure that they are doing some stress testing around at least a few of them.
So what's your list of possible gray swans for 23?
Sure. You can pretty much break them up into 7 categories. So they can be geopolitical, right? So anything having to do with politics and war or disgruntlement between nations. So that's one. A second is economic, right? A third is social. A fourth is something that's policy induced, right? Another is environmental. A sixth is technological. And then if I haven't depressed everyone enough, the 7th one is positive, something that's beneficially transformative. So thinking about that, I'm happy to talk about a few gray swans for this year in each of those categories.
Yeah, please do.
Sure. So let's first start with geopolitical. There's, the war in Ukraine is front and center. The anniversary is right here. And yet there's still no resolution, and it seems like things are getting worse. How could things get worse? Well, I think one imaginable but low probability event is that this war spills over into a NATO country, right? So far it's been relegated to Ukraine. Ukraine's not part of NATO. even though Ukraine is receiving support from NATO allies, including the US and Germany. But let's say it spills over, right? Then you draw in NATO directly into this conflict. And I think that's something that President Putin in Russia has been very careful about, making sure that it's kind of remaining amongst, or at least within, economies that aren't part of NATO, but suppose that spills over. And then something related to that, NATO, is what if NATO actually disintegrates, right? Where the pressures are too great, or economies are not interested in deploying either funds or people to NATO, and it breaks apart. Well, that has significant global implications, because then there's no resistance, if you will, to some of the geopolitical aims of Russia as well as China. So, again, while these are not the base case, and we think that we don't even think they're risks necessarily, they are gray swans. Some other geopolitical events that we might think about is the relationship between the US and China. We know it's been very tense, even going back to 2018, 2019, and we had the trade wars, and certainly even fast forwarding to now, we have the US limiting semiconductor shipments to China, and China, cracking down on what businesses can do, US foreign businesses, in particular the US. And also China's relationship with Russia. I mean, that also, all those things are kind of tied together. So we know these tensions are strong, but one big gray swan is, what if China does take full control over Taiwan? Well, of course, that draws in almost every economy. Why? Because Taiwan is a huge producer of semiconductors. And semiconductors are computer chips, and all computer chips are not created equally. They're all different. And even if you think about a car, it's got thousands of different types of chips. And so if you have an entire economy that, is essentially cut off because it's being fully absorbed into China, then you're going to have potentially major semiconductor chip shortages. And we got a little taste of that during the pandemic, where all of a sudden the prices of goods, of anything that cars, appliances that use computer chips, spiked. Number one, because you couldn't get those chips. And number two, it was difficult to ship them around the world. So that's certainly not, we certainly aren't pricing in China, fully taking over Taiwan, but it certainly is something that could potentially happen. And so those are just a few of the kind of top of mind geopolitical gray swans you might think of. When we think about energy and environment, well, looking at China, again, China, Russia, the Congo, all these economies have in common is that they produce rare earths. What are rare earths? Rare earths are materials that go into batteries. And batteries are going to be, they are and will continue to be very critical to the global energy transition. And certainly if you have economies, in particular China, deciding, as part of their policy that they want to restrict exports in those goods or raise prices very precipitously, then that's going to have a massive shock, and it's going to affect the ability of the electrification and the use of batteries around the world as an alternative source of energy. So that's one of the environmental and energy ones. One that may be a little bit closer to home to some people is looking at the Middle East. So the MENA region, the Middle East region, is still a huge producer of oil and natural gas. And certainly, even though we're going through this energy transition, fossil fuels are part of that transition. Most of the world is still running on coal and oil and gas, and it's going to take time to transition. And certainly natural gas is thought of as a transition material. But let's say that you have these big oil facilities in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or the UAE, and they all come under attack at once. Now, we had a little taste of that a few years ago when parts of the Saudi Arabia energy production infrastructure was bombed But what if this all happens and you have this big disruption? Certainly that could be, and that disruption is lengthy and it's happening all at once. So that's another gray swan. Another interesting gray swan around energy and environment is, well, I'm going to combine a couple of these things, but certainly flooding and droughts, right? Flooding is too much water, droughts are not enough water. But certainly you could have the case where you have in Antarctica, there's these giant ice shelves, and one of the biggest ones is being undermined right now by water, right? The seas are warmer and it's undermining this ice shelf. Should this ice shelf break off, it could potentially raise sea levels by something nuts like, 10 meters or something like that. But that's really significant because you have many, many low-lying areas throughout the world, especially major cities, not just only in emerging markets, but even in the US, that could potentially become inundated with water. And so that means that you'd have material losses in terms of insurance, you'd have massive amounts of migration. It would just be really devastating and dramatic. Now, again, these are gray swans, low probability events, but this could certainly happen.
Yeah, and you talked about the pandemic being a black swan event, which is sort of unpredictable. But I start, and you said there could be more pandemics. It's interesting when that you say that, because you're reading now about this Marburg virus, which is breaking out, which is very deadly. Zika, of course, is a problem. You certainly have possibility of more COVID variants. So that once black swan event could still be, have gray swan offspring, right?
Yes, absolutely. And certainly the key issue is, would the world's response be the same, right? Would we still fight to, find cures and vaccines and treatments, or would we just say, well, this is just another thing that we can just get over and ignore, and it becomes out of control to the point where governments start shutting down again? So I think that, certainly you could have these residual effects from one black swan event. And I think that's very evident, certainly just, again, going back to the war in Ukraine, one country invades another and it causes hunger throughout the world and inflation in terms of elevated food and energy prices. And then you have sanctions and reprisals that cause, a crisis of living in Europe and political unrest in MENA and Asian regions, and also in sub-Saharan Africa, because there's a lack of food and energy is too expensive. So you could certainly have this kind of domino effect of other things happening on account of the realization of a single gray swan.
Baby swans are called cygnets. As I listen to you talk, you have to think about the gray swans, but you have to think about all their gray cygnets too, because each one of these could have a knock-on effect or a ripple effect, or some. So there's the war in Ukraine, but that impacts that area. It was the energy and the food implications of it that started hitting supply chains elsewhere. So there's this. So I'm trying, as I'm thinking about, how do we advise members to think about these things? You really do need to get down to each knock-on effect or unintended consequence.
Well, that's why we call them global gray swans. But there's great news, Steve. We actually have a tool that we are building out called the Global Gray Swans tool. It's actually an offshoot of an existing tool. We have the China Gray Swans tool that was developed by our experts in our China Center. And basically, this tool outlines a number of these seemingly outlandish, but still potentially realistic events. And we not only talk about what is it and describe what is it, but we also talk about why does it matter? Like, what are the impacts on business? What are the impacts on economics? And also, what are some of the early signals, right? And we also, and in this tool, we're nice enough to actually tell you whether we think the direction is trending to become more subdued or dormant or more extreme. And the nice thing about this, the great thing about this tool is we also talk about the macroeconomic impacts as well as the impact on business. And we have a scoring mechanism. So we're going to put in our own scoring. So for example, in the US, an economic gray swan is that the US defaults on its sovereign debt after the debt ceiling is breached. Now, this has never happened, and it comes up every time we have a debt ceiling issue, but the risks are much higher now than they've ever been. So we might make that on a score of 4 out of 5, right? But if you're a business, you might look at all these different gray swans and have different views on how those gray swans might affect your business, and you could change the risk, and then it all aggregates into a score. And you can put in scoring by region if you're a multinational, or by industry if you are a multifaceted company with hands in many industries. And the thing is that we're more than happy to sit down with you and actually talk about and go through the swans that are very important to you and help you to rank them to understand how serious any one of them are for your business. And that's part of that's the first step in terms of understanding what's really important and thinking about what your response is going to be should any of these swans be realized.
We're talking about gray swans and what businesses should do about them. We're going to take a short break and we'll be right back.
As you and your company monitor the volatile and uncertain economy, the award-winning forecast team at the Conference Board predicts a downturn by the end of 2022. Recession will further compound the crises that have recently upended expectations, from a deadly pandemic to a war in Ukraine and the highest inflation in decades. Yet, unprecedented crises also present unforeseen opportunities if you have a trusted, proven navigator by your side. With that in mind, and as the Conference Board has always done, we are providing you with daily, timely, and relevant content that will guide the business community through the economic storm. These trusted insights are being gathered on our website and are available to help your company master the challenges. To find out how you can chart a course for the future which will allow your business to emerge stronger on the other side, visit our free economic hub entitled Navigating the Economic Storm, your indispensable guide through the global recession, located at conference-board.org/topics/recession.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland from the Conference Board, and I'm joined by Dana Peterson, the Chief Economist at the Conference Board. So Dana, before the break, you were talking about this new tool that you have to develop risk probabilities around gray swans. How would you advise our listeners to access that tool?
Sure. So like I said, we have 2 tools right now. One is already established. That's a China Global Gray Swans tool. It's already pre-existent on the China Center website, and you can download it. The nice thing is it's going to be updated in very short order within another few weeks, and there's going to be a great report. We're also going to publish the Global Gray Swan tool within a few weeks, and you'll be able to find that on our MyTCB website as well.
Okay, that's great. So how are you advising listeners or our members to plan for these things? How do you've got the tool, just talk us through the logic of, you're running a business, you got all these things that could happen. I mean, gosh, just listening to you, there's so many things that you could talk yourself into almost anything. But how does a business leader prioritize these things, assign probabilities to them, and think about, what is the probable outcome?
Sure. Well, the great news is that we've also produced a 7-part series on how to manage different profiles of risk for your business. I don't remember all 7, but they're all on our MyTCB website. But, a number of them, number one is having backstops in place as a business, integrating risk analysis and scenario building into your business is so critical. And if you already have that established, then it's easy to do, right? So if someone presents you with a laundry list of risks, you already know what steps to take. But if you don't have that implemented, then it's really important to do so. And it's key that, executives have the support of their boards to actually implement these types of risk management tools within the business. So I think that's really the first step. But, if you haven't done any of that, the first step is to come to us and we'll sit down with you with the tool to at least identify all the things that might be important for you.
Yeah, and the steps that companies can take are the obvious ones. I mean, you have to start with people, and so you have to take care of your customers, make sure that you've got all sorts of backup systems for that you're taking care of your people. But then it's about financial stability and making sure that you have the financial wherewithal to deal with possible fluctuations, access to the capital markets, and those kinds of things. So I guess what you're saying is, in the end, I mean, just to put a giant label on it is, you take a little bit more conservative financial management profile.
Yeah, so something that we've written about in that 7-part series is just having liquidity, right? We saw back during the financial crisis where liquidity dried up nearly overnight. Businesses were not able to access capital, both from financial markets as well as from third-party entities. So it's very important to make sure that whatever comes your way, that your businesses are liquid. And it's not only that, you have to make sure that your counterparties, meaning your customers and all the folks within your supply chain, also have adequate liquidity. And if they don't, do you have contingency plans and making sure that you have enough reserves such that if all of your customers or a good percentage of them default, that your business won't suffer a catastrophic loss or even collapse.
Yeah, so it's really contingency planning, but contingency planning beyond the close-in things, because there's so many exogenous factors in a more globalized world. So that's kind of what I hear you saying in this, and it's a matter of sitting down and really doing an exercise of saying what are they, what are the possibilities, assign your own probability to it, and then trying to understand and map. Then if that happens, it's sort of the if that happens, then what would be the impact on my business, and then how do I just hedge against those potential risks? So there is some science and some process to this exercise.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So let's just run through the list again, and give your own guesstimate of the probability for these things. Let's just talk about some. You mentioned some of the downside risk. Intensification of Ukraine war and then thereby affecting global businesses, high, low?
I think if on a scale of 1 to 5, I'd probably skew it towards the high side, maybe giving it a 4, because this could lead to a broader conflict that involves all industries. Now, some industries will have the opportunity for growth in that scenario, clearly, because they'll be part of that war effort. But then, consumer spending is going to collapse, right? Because consumers will have to, redirect their focus on like a war machine type mentality. And so that will be bad for services. So I think that, it's certainly not a good thing. Of course, there'll be the humanitarian crisis aspect of it, but it's really going to disrupt the economy in terms of, again, shifting between what's most important in terms of producing goods versus services.
Another thing you've written about is labor shortages and the effect on compensation. Your thoughts on probabilities there?
Well, again, I think that's I would give that even a 5. We're already seeing the repercussions of labor shortages, and they're just going to become worse, and they're going to be an issue for the foreseeable future unless there are significant policy changes. Certainly businesses can put band-aids on the problem. Indeed, they are. They're raising wages and benefits, and that's feeding into inflation. And so we're seeing that in real time. But certainly if you don't see policies that encourage people to go into trades or or policies that encourage people to enter the labor market and remain there, or even immigration policies. And this is not just in the US, but certainly in Europe and China and Japan. Then we're just going to see even worse labor shortages and even faster inflation, and central banks having to raise interest rates even more aggressively and keeping them elevated more aggressively, which ultimately can cause longer and deeper recessions.
Yeah, and even though we and other economic forecasting groups, say that this should be a relatively mild recession, and we're just about done, maybe one or two small rate hikes. I mean, the possibilities are that it could be higher. And so, if you're talking about a gray swan event, higher inflation, higher interest rates, would be, I guess, a gray swan on top of what would be a normalized prediction.
Well, I actually think it's more of a risk, meaning that it's more likely to happen. Certainly we're very concerned about lingering inflation pressures, and certainly China is going to reopen, which is great for the domestic economy. It's also great for all the other economies that benefit from tourism, but it also means there's going to be stronger demand for energy, and oil prices are priced at a global level. And so that means that, China reopening and coming back could potentially mean faster inflation and stickier inflation. And central banks that have been talking about being close to the end of their tightening cycles might not be. And certainly, even when we're looking at the war in Ukraine, it's having significant implications for food prices, in addition to bad events like droughts and flooding and bird flu and all those kinds of things. And inflation can be much stickier. And so that's certainly something that we think is a little more probable. But if we enter a period of stagflation, which is essentially very low growth and high inflation over an extended period of time, that's certainly not something that I think a lot of businesses are prepared for. And it's something that they should be thinking about.
Yeah, and then you've talked about some of the geopolitical risks. Of course, there's the China-US situation. Obviously, Russia, Ukraine, Russia and China, but there's also Greece and Turkey. There's also North Korea and Iran. All these.
Yes.
And the possibility here that the world kind of lines up into two blocks. Essentially, with the Western bloc on one side and the axis of China and Russia and their satellites on the other hand. If that goes into deeper divisions into those blocks, does that create further downside risks for companies?
Oh yes, absolutely. Especially if you're multinational, because what do? Right? You have businesses set up in both of the two blocks. Do you have different business models? Do you have different ways of operating? And all that is expensive. It's complicated. And you may even need to pull out of a certain country because you're on the wrong side of the railroad tracks, if you will. So I think that's very complex and certainly something businesses are going to have to consider. And it's interesting, Steve, in our latest CEO Outlook, we asked executives, what are you doing with your supply chains? And in the US, 44%, and maybe even a little bit higher, said they're going to do absolutely nothing with their supply chains, meaning they're fully aware of the divisions, especially between the US and China and different economies lining up with those two big economies, but they're not thinking about, or they're not actively doing anything about protecting their supply chains. And that may come as a shock to some businesses if industrial policies start weighing more heavily on what they do. And industrial policies are basically when government tells business where they can situate their factories and their supply chains.
Yeah, and if you think about all of these possible gray swan events and risks that you've talked about, every one of them, weighs heavily on the supply chain, whether it's, raw inputs or whether it's manufacturing conversion capacity and where it is. We have so much of our supply chains invested in China, and that simply could disappear. It seems to me that if you're advising companies and to look at gray swan events, you have to be advising them to diversify their supply chains near shore, onshore. get it spread out a little bit to de-risk, right?
Yes. I mean, but it's expensive. That's why lots of firms don't want to do it.
It's
But
expensive and it's time consuming. Yeah.
yes. And I think another area companies really need to think about, if they aren't already, is the advance of technology. We've had certain types of technology like, quantum computing, AI, 3D printing, and all that's just kind of been out there, the metaverse, and all those things have just been kind of not really absorbed by businesses. But all of a sudden, these things are now becoming commercial. And this is going to be highly disruptive. I just think about what we do. We create insights. So what if you, Steve, get a chatbot? Oh, we already have chatbots, and you start replacing some of your economists and your researchers because the chatbot can, Chat GPT can write a better report than we can. So automation is going to be huge, and it's going to be very disruptive. Just think about if 3D printing became commercially available, where every household had a 3D printer. All of a sudden, they could print whatever goods they might have been purchasing from retailers, right? Or getting shipped from abroad. So I think all of these things are really big issues that firms need to think about in terms of being highly disruptive, in some ways for the better, but also in some ways for the worse.
Wait a minute, Dana, I'm still writing. Replace all economists with Chat GPT. I got it. Okay. There you go. In the insight of the day. Absolutely not. Dana Peterson, you are irreplaceable. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Absolutely, Steve. It's always fun. Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for listening in to CEO Perspectives. Every week, I'll be joined by a prominent thought leader to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover the leading topics in economics, geopolitics, public policy, and more. Please share CEO Perspectives with your colleagues, with your friends, with your family, with all of your economists. I'm Steve Odland, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.